Plug it in, plug it in. Hello, my friends. I'm here with another one of these very casual, off-the-cuff discussion videos about something that's just been on my mind. And as always, if it's just something I've been thinking about a whole lot, but probably not quite substantial enough to, like, do a full scripted deep dive video on, I do one of these. I just sit down in front of the microphone and I just start talking. So that is what I'm here now to do. So, some time back, there was an analyst who kind of predicted that Nintendo could potentially sort of change the way that they handle hardware generations. Basically, they said, hey, you know what Nintendo should do, or could do, or possibly will do? The Switch could become basically like Apple's iPhone. I mean, it's not even really just the iPhone, really any phone, phone manufacturer. Like what Apple does with the iPhone, they don't wait 5, 6, 7 years and then release a brand new, super, way better iPhone. No, they're releasing one like every year. These upgrades come really incrementally. And if you look at the timeline, you get an iPhone whatever, and then 7 years later, it's the iPhone whatever. But like there is a really big jump. So it almost kind of is like a full like generational leap in the same way that consoles tend to do it. But there are a lot more in between. He's suggesting that the Switch could be Nintendo's iPhone, essentially. When I first heard this idea, my knee-jerk reaction was to kind of just dismiss it. Like I hear that and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's dumb though. Analysts are always talking about what they think Nintendo might or should do, and they're usually wrong because they're not usually looking at the video game market with a lot of clarity or experience. They're kind of like comparing it to every other market, and they usually have like a very surface level understanding of what goes on in the game industry, so they don't really get it. So I'm like, nah, that's dumb, write it off. But here's the thing, change is inevitable, and I never want to write off an idea simply because it's different and it goes against the way that it's been. And I feel like there is some at least slight validity to this idea, at least to the point where I feel it's worth discussing. Because like I said, I've been thinking about it. It's just a topic that's on my mind a lot, so it must be worth discussing. I want to kind of explore like how that might work and if it is possible. Because here's the thing, their whole entire point was that there's one really giant benefit to this. Traditionally, you have these very clear-cut console generations. There's the Switch. Traditionally, we will get the Switch 2 or whatever in a few years, and that might be able to play Switch 1 games, but Switch 1 owners, they won't be able to play Switch 2 games. So every time Nintendo releases a new major new console, their install base starts over, fresh, completely. And that's really difficult because, like, the whole point of a console is to get it in people's hands. The whole point is to grow that install base so you can then sell those customers software. The bigger the install base, the more potential sales for literally any piece of software. And every time you release a new console, it all goes out the window. Just all of it. You'll have some cross-gen stuff, but for the most part, if you want to play the new games, you got to get the new thing and you start over from scratch. That's not exactly fun for the company. I can definitely see the frustration there. So if Nintendo were to upgrade the Switch more incrementally like a phone, that could technically sort of skirt it. I suppose with this idea, either there wouldn't really be a Switch 2 anytime soon, instead like next year, if we are going to get a Switch Pro, it wouldn't even really be a Switch Pro, and then we get Switch 2, it would be, this is Switch 1.3, or it's just the next, or it could be called Switch 2, but we just register it as an incremental increase and games work across both systems, and then we get a 3 and then a 4, and then maybe once you hit 5, then all of a sudden people who only have a Switch 1 can't play up to Switch 5 games. You have like a breadth of console versions that you can play. Like, that's what's being proposed. And like I said, change is inevitable. In fact, I'd say even all of last generation, we all sort of felt this change coming to the way that consoles are. We haven't exactly seen it yet, but like the first rumblings of major change have been rumbling. We know that eventually everything will be all streaming. Right now, we don't have the internet infrastructure to support that, but eventually, yeah, probably it won't matter what device you're playing on because all you're doing is streaming it from somewhere else. That is the direction that we are heading. And so You know, even as far as, like I said, last generation, there were people being like, do we even need consoles anymore? Obviously we do, but the fact that these questions are coming up means change is inevitable. It's not going to stay the same forever. Just because it's been this way this whole time doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. It's a very silly line of thinking. Just because this is what I've always experienced, that means that no, it's going to stay traditional, 5 to 7 years between every console generation. It's going to be a box, and it's going to sit in your living room, and yada yada. And in fact, Nintendo already kind of changed things a bit. Like previously, Nintendo was following along with the traditional console generations, off by only, you know, a year. And then with the Switch, they kind of plunked a console down in the middle of a generation. They kind of gave us, like, that was Gen 8, but then, like, Wii U was a Gen 8 system, but then we got the Switch also. Is that Gen 8? Is that Gen 9? Is that 8.5? We don't really know. Nintendo already kind of threw the whole idea of generations, like, into disarray. So them kind of breaking down that even further, like, it's not completely out of the question. So then, if we know it's technically possible, Nintendo is not to be beholden to this this console generation thing the way that it's been going, then is this possible? Is it possible that this specific thing will happen, that the Switch could become the iPhone? Let's take a look at what that would actually look like. Well, actually, first, let's look at what the rest of the industry is doing real quick. So mid-generation console refreshes have become, you know, a basic thing. Nintendo originally did it with the new 3DS, and in that case, there were a handful of games that only worked on the new 3DS and not the original. Not very many though. But then you have PlayStation and Xbox. They had, you know, the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X were both mid-generation. It was just like the same console, but better, beefier, display at a higher resolution, but all of the games still work equally across both. There were no exclusive PS4 Pro or, you know, Xbox One X games. And here's the thing, like, we can definitely see the rest of the industry trying to deal with this whole idea of completely resetting your install base every time. Very commonly, for the last few generations, you get a lot of cross-gen games, you know, games that, especially like the big third parties like Ubisoft and the Assassin's Creed games, there's always cross-gen games for like 1 or 2 generations, where they're like, or not generations, 1 or 2 years at the start of a console's life, where they're like, okay, it's gonna come out on the new one, but also the old one, because we don't want to leave that big fat install base behind. That would be ridiculous. And this generation, more than ever, I think that Sony and Microsoft are understanding that it seems to me that the community is less excited for this generation than basically ever. Like, each new generation becomes a little bit less exciting. Even just last gen, even Gen 8. I remember everyone being like, I don't know, my 360 and my PS3 are still pretty great. These graphics are still pretty good. Do I really need to upgrade? It takes longer and longer for us to be convinced, you know, like on a really wide scale. And like, yeah, these new systems are the most powerful ever by a degree of a trillion or whatever. And yet, like, we're seeing such diminishing returns in terms of graphics and all that stuff. Like, personally, I'm not super excited yet. I will be. It'll come. It just takes longer. And I think Sony and Microsoft are understanding that, because a lot of their games, like, I believe there are more cross-gen games than ever. In fact, a lot of really big PS5 games, like, that you would expect to be a big, massive system seller, like the new Horizon game and stuff, cross-gen. Like, you would think Sony, like a first party of all people, because like a third party, they're gonna want to just go where the money is, no matter what. You think that a first party is like, no, we want people buying the new one. That benefits us the most. It's not just about the money, it's about building that install base for later. And yet, even then, even considering that, Sony is still like, nah, like a lot of these big PS5 games coming, you could still play on your PS4, because they don't want to shoot themselves in the foot and, you know, keep trying to sell these games to a really tiny install base. They're trying to, like, kind of balance it. They want the bigger install base for later, but they also need the money. You know what I mean? And Xbox is going even further with this. I believe they said that the first 2 years of the Xbox Series X, Series S's life, all of those games are going to be cross-gen. Like, all of those games will be playable on the Xbox One. 2 years. That is a really, really long time. Now, Microsoft itself has already been kind of like doing the console thing, but kind of moving away from it too, where it's like, it's Game Pass and multi-plats that are also on PC. So it's like they're not going just like fully into the whole console thing anymore. They've danced around with the idea of changing it, but I still think that's really interesting because them and Sony are kind of doing that too. All that to say, these are issues. The whole issue of install base and you know, regular upgrades. Like, for all we know, Sony and Microsoft are going to want to start doing the iPhone thing, you know? They're not going to want to just do set numbers anymore, you know, PlayStation 5, 6, 7, 8. Maybe they're also going to want to kind of diminish this thing, and maybe this is sort of a test for them. And so we have to look at Nintendo, and of course, like, the Switch is like, you know, it's smaller, it's got like the mobile architecture, it's more like a phone, so it's easy to imagine that they do the phone kind of thing. And so we come to it. So can that work? Can Nintendo do that? And I would say, like, I mean, like, it's almost not even worth saying, like, mobile phone games and apps and stuff are very different from big software. Like, a very concrete console generation, it fits video games a little bit better than mobile stuff. Mobile games are generally smaller experiences. I know there's some like big, you know, especially like multiplayer games and stuff, but like for the most part, like phone games and software and stuff, it's much smaller. It's cheaper. It's often free. So, and like people are regularly upgrading their phones because they're such common items. And it's funny because it's like phones are usually way more expensive than systems, which is really funny that like we're like, spending $400 every 7 years, that's too much. But then people are like, $1,000 for a phone that I'd upgrade in 2 years. Okay, sure, why not? But we use them every day. And so like upgrading a phone is already a more expected sort of thing. And like keeping your old phone is not. Like the phone itself, that whole architecture, it's made to be progressed and carried along with you. You're not keeping your iPhone 1. Well, okay, you might, because it's a kind of a relic at this point. But, you know, you're not keeping it to, like, play all the iPhone 1 games because, oh, Apple won't release the iPhone 1 games on the iPhone a billion. You know, it's not like Nintendo, where you got to hold on to your GameCube so you can actually, like, play GameCube games. Like, no, like, that's how phones work. Video games are harder, though. Like, the software is just bigger. It takes longer to develop, and so that's why it's always fit to have these generations. Because the thing about it is that it works on the phone because it's simpler. It's easier to grasp. But if you're looking at video games, that would be a lot more complicated. If I go to Best Buy, there are Switch games. There's a big section of Switch games. A few years ago, it was Switch games and Wii U games. A few years before that, it was Wii U and Wii games. Like, Nintendo's whole, like, ecosystem is kind of confusing, you know, 3DS, 2DS, where are the 2DS games? So they have done some to, like, make that kind of confusing, but for the most part, it's pretty cut and dry. A console has its games. So if you start doing this new model where you're incrementally upgrading, that's a lot more to communicate to people of like, are you able to play this game? Like, it would have to be plastered all over the cases and the sections and the stores and everything. It would be like, oh, well, you know, this is the Switch 1 through 3 games, but then if beyond that, this is the 4 through 5, or like, if you want to buy this game, you have to have somewhere between Switch version 3 and 7, or you know, 1.3 and 2.1. It's just a lot more complicated. A parent would not easily be able to go to the store and just like, this is a game my kid can buy on his thing. They're not going to know that he's got a Switch 1.7 and this game only supports back to Switch 2.3. Because that's not how video games have ever worked. It's got the Switch branding. He has a Switch. This game is for a Switch. And like the Switch and its games, they are much better at being adaptable, you know, like, you know, portable versus docked mode can change the performance. And, you know, as we've been talking about, if there is a Switch Pro, it could run the games better. It's all a lot more flexible. It's a lot more scalable. But generally, I don't think it's as scalable as like a mobile game where it's going to work on any number of phones. Like when you're looking at video game console architecture, for the most part, it's got to run natively. And if the hardware gets too weird, if it's, you know, different from the previous hardware, then it's going to have to emulate it, and that's going to be a lot harder. And the thing is, like, there's always going to have to be a line that's drawn. Every time Nintendo releases a new game, they're going to say, you have to have a version whatever or later to play this game, and everyone is going to be constantly seeking that information. And they're gonna constantly be disappointing people, you know, like, oh, I've had this Switch and I'm gonna be nervous about the time when they finally do one more slight upgrade to the hardware and I get bumped off. And a lot of people are gonna feel that way. Every single time they make that small jump, a bunch of people are left completely in the dust saying, I have a Switch and I can't play the new Switch game. That stinks. I mean, just imagine that, you know, you got one at launch. That's great, it plays Switch games, but then they're like, you know, Breath of the Wild 3 or whatever. Oh, sorry, you just didn't quite make it. And essentially, it's sort of the same thing as having different console generations, and yet it's not, because that's expected. When they release the Switch 2, and it's got all these, like, brand new features, and it's way more powerful, that's gonna be a thing. You wanna play Breath of the Wild 3, it's gonna be on the new Switch. You have to buy a new Switch. Okay, I get that, and that's fine, because I bought one Switch, I bought Switch 1, and okay, here we are. It's 7 years later. I understand. It's finally time to buy the new one. It's so much more clear and easy, and so much easier for Nintendo to communicate all that to me. A parent goes to the store. This is a Switch 2 game. Do you have a Switch 2? Yeah? Okay, here you go. It's not Switch 1.7, 1.3, 2. Whatever, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is also like, oh, my son has a Switch. Oh, is it a Switch 8 though? What's Switch 8? What's a Switch? Oh no. So that right there is why I'm skeptical of the idea. And it is very possible that I'm just not considering something. Maybe there's an aspect of this, even when compared to phones, that it's like, you silly, phones do it this way, and that's why that would be better. So yeah, basically, I'm skeptical. I'm open to the idea of consoles and console generations, the whole idea kind of getting torn down a bit. Everything is becoming more scalable. I mean, look, like Microsoft right out of the gate, they didn't like wait until later. Right out of the gate, it's the Series X and the Series S, where one is like the big premium one and the other is like just kind of cheaper. It just doesn't output to like 4K all of the time, and it's cheaper, but it's lower power. It's just like that right there. That already says something about just the scalability and the flexibility of new games and new consoles. Could Nintendo do something like that? Or could they end up doing somewhere between a phone and a console where it's really only every few years? You know, maybe there end up being 3 versions of the Switch instead of just a Switch and a new Switch, or a Switch Pro or whatever. You know, maybe it's not so predictable. Maybe they do more to alleviate all this by extending backwards compatibility just by a lot and making their games a lot more scalable. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if it goes very far across the different versions. You know, like if a person buys a Switch and they're basically guaranteed to be able to play the next 7 years of games on it, you know, no matter how, even if there is a new Switch every year, if you can guarantee, Nintendo could even say, like, you will be able to play this game on our games on your Switch for 7 years. Like, would that make it better? Then everybody going will know. That won't eliminate all of the confusion, especially, you know, with the people, the parents and the people who don't know about all this stuff that are in the store. That would still require a lot of work. So ultimately, the real question is, even if this is plausible, even if it's gonna happen, is it worth it? That's the final question that I'm asking myself. Is that worth the benefit? As we said, the benefit is not leaving your whole entire install base behind every, 7 years. Is that enough? Is that worth it for all of the confusion? It's just, it's more complicated. It means Nintendo themselves have to spend R&D, like, cause that's a really big one right there. Every time they improve their system, in any significant way, that's R&D. That's not just, like when they upgraded the base model Switch, but they just put a better chip in there. That wasn't really hard. That was just switching some stuff around and using a better chip. In this other case, it would mean designing a new Switch every time. Every time it's shaped a little differently, and its insides are kind of moved around a different way. That's a lot of work. Is that worth it? The confusion on the end of the customers, the disappointment when people are dropped off the family or whatever, and the R&D into the systems, is that worth helping the whole install base problem? I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I'm still, like I said, I'm still very skeptical of this idea, but it is an interesting idea. I do think it's a very interesting idea, and it's worth at least thinking about and talking about. down in the comments. Do you think it would be worth it? Do you think the install base is like that should be protected more than anything? Do you think this is dumb? Best idea in the world? Let me know. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble for so long about this, and you have a wonderful day, and I love you, and goodbye.